like I on like no. Of whom then shall I be afraid? Welcome to this broadcast from Shalem, and we hope that tonight you will be blessed. Tonight we are going to be looking at the of issue of pain and suffering and evil. There's always a question as to why we have so much evil in this world, and the question that follows from that really is, what is God doing? Why is God allowing all of this? And tonight we're going to be allowing Ravi Zacharias to run to answer this question. And then when you are finished, we hope to have questions from you so that we can discuss it. If you type your questions in Facebook as a comment, we will see it straight away. and I hope that we can have this broadcast running. So sit back as we try to get this video for you. And the question is there a meaning in evil and suffering? But before we do that, let us have a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, tonight we thank you for your blessings. Thank you, O God, for all that you've done for us. And even in this time of pain and sorrow, Father, we come to you because we know that you are the author and the finisher of our faith, and there is none in heaven or earth like you. We pray, Heavenly Father, that even as we deliberate on your word, that we would find comfort and strength therein. We ask in Jesus' name. Amen. Just hold for a second as I cue this video up. Just give me a moment.
Mr. Anderson received his Master's of Science from Yale University, a Master's in Government from Georgetown University. He has authored over 12 books, including his most recent one, Moral Dilemmas, and he has participated as a moderator in numerous radio and television forums. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Kirby Anderson.
Thank you, Linda, and thank you for being a part of this Science and Faith Lecture Forum. I think that Ravi Zacharias has begun us in a very good way in terms of looking at this many provocative things to consider and to discuss. For the next 2 hours, we are going to be carrying on a discussion and a debate, and you will be able to participate in it as well. But first, we will be hearing from our panelists, who I'll introduce in just a minute, who will present various worldviews, try to answer this very provocative question of evil and suffering from their particular worldview. Then the other panelists will engage in a discussion and debate. That will take place for the next hour. The following hour, we'll be taking questions from the audience as well as from the internet. And so you will be thinking ahead of time about questions that you would want to direct to one of the panelists or to Ravi Zacharias, and we will tell you more about that in just a few minutes. But first of all, let me represent the panel as best as I can. Representing an Eastern worldview will be Mohanty. Dr. Mohanty is Professor of Philosophy and Asian Studies at Emory University and also Professor of Philosophy at Temple University. He earned a BA and MA degree from the University of Calcutta and earned his doctoral degree in philosophy from the University of Göttingen, and later was conferred an honorary doctorate from the University of Calcutta. Representing a naturalist worldview will be Dr. Bernard Lykken. He is a plasma physicist, familiar to skeptics for his pioneering work in explaining the physics of firewalking, as well as personal participation in such. He has lectured at a number of different universities and conducted research at the University of Maryland, UCLA, the Lawrence Livermore Laboratory, General Atomics, and he is also a senior editor of Skeptic Magazine, the official publication of the Skeptic Society. Representing a Christian worldview will be Dr. William Lane Craig. Dr. Craig has received master's degrees from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, a PhD from the University of Birmingham, and a Doctor of Theology from the University of Munich. Each one of them will be given an opportunity to present their particular worldview, to ask some questions, and that will then be followed up by other members of the panelists. Beginning this discussion will be Dr. Mahanti.
Thank you very much. There are lectures where you can follow up by asking questions. I think Dr. Zakaria's lecture was not one of those. It inspired us, it inspired me. Instead of asking questions, I will present to him certain statements to which, if he likes, he can respond. We philosophers are notorious for being trained to ask questions and never to answer them. I do not want to play that role. I agree with him that the exact problem of evil, pain and suffering, which arises when within a monotheistic religion, does not arise outside of those religious worldviews. I agree that reductive naturalism cannot raise that problem and doubt if it can formulate any other problem of evil. My belief is that no religion, not to speak of the monotheistic religions, can satisfactorily solve the problem which they have raised. But I recognize that they have sought to find solutions with the most subtle intellectual means. Even if they can solve the presence of evil and suffering, they cannot, so I think, have a good explanation, why is it that I suffer? Why me? No general explanatory principle, whether of science or of theology, can satisfactorily answer the question, why me? The kind of question which we often ask. What I'm emphasizing is the unique singularity of existential subjectivity, cannot be squeezed into a law-like account. Some of the pain and suffering to be found in the world can be naturalistically, historically, and socially accounted for, and can be prevented by taking appropriate measures. But there still remain a remainder of sheer unmerited, unjustified pain. How to account for it? This pain cannot be reduced to moral evil. Now, Gandhi once said that the Bihar earthquake was God's punishment for the sin of untouchability. The poet Tagore protested. Gandhi reaffirmed that this was unquestionably obvious to him.
My apologies to you, but we started the wrong video, so we're going to start the right one now, and our deep apologies.
You to the Galleria Center in Atlanta, Georgia. This evening, Ravi Zacharias will address the question, is there meaning in evil and suffering? Joining Ravi will be panelists Dr. Bernard Leikind, Dr. Jitendra Murthy, and Dr. William Lane Craig. Our moderator is J. Kirby Anderson.
The world is a place that is ruled by injustice and truth, a place that is all too often where the weak are slaughtered by the strong, where the indiscriminate destruction of innocent life is passively observed. The acknowledgement that evil and suffering exist and affects all of our lives has led many to conclude that God, if he exists at all, is either indifferent, impotent, or even sadistic. For others, the problem of evil and suffering does not speak to the existence of God, nor his character. The universe and that all that it contains is a product of mere chance, a collection of molecules that ultimately led to the consciousness of man. The problem, therefore, of evil and suffering is one of man's intellect and his will to survive, a problem that, given time, education, and enlightenment, will ultimately be corrected. For the Christian, the problem of evil and suffering, while difficult to understand, does not nullify the existence of God nor speak to his character, but rather shows his benevolence, his patience, and forbearance. Tonight, we are going to discuss this most difficult questions. If God is a benevolent, all-powerful deity, how is it that he tolerates evil and allows mankind to suffer? To address this difficult question and to do it in a scholarly and rigorous manner, the Faith and Science Lecture Forum has invited Dr. Ravi Zacharias to address tonight's event. Dr. Zacharias received his Master's of Divinity degree from Trinity Divinity College and has been conferred from Asbury and Houghton Colleges. He has been an invited lecturer at Cambridge University and has authored numerous books, including Can Man Live Without God? And Deliver Us from Evil, Restoring the Soul to Declining Civilization. Please welcome with me now as we introduce Dr. Ravi Zacharias to tonight's event.
Thank you, Dr. Tumlin, and it's really a delight for me to be here and have this opportunity to present these thoughts to you. I'm honored that Dr. Bernard Lycan, Dr. Jitendra Mohanty, and Dr. William Lane Craig will be participants even as we interact on these very, very rigorous issues that each one of them has given serious thought to. And when Jim Tumlin invited me to come and address this, I knew one thing would be beyond a reasonable doubt after the evening is over. When you consider the scholarship of these gentlemen who we'll be interacting with, my willingness to come here and address the subject will prove beyond a reasonable doubt that some suffering is voluntary. And I have no doubt about that. The closer the deadline came, the more I began to ask myself, why on earth did you get into this? It's a little bit reminiscent of C.S. Lewis, who wrote one of the most powerful books on the subject, The Problem of Pain, in which at one point he says, if only this toothache would go away, I could write another chapter on the problem of pain. But here we are dealing with this, and I believe is reflective of your interest and the interests of people in many parts of the globe who are tuning in and listening in at the same time. Andrew Fletcher, the 18th century's Scottish political activist, made this comment when you think of the remarkable foresight he had in saying this, you'll see how appropriate for our time. Let me write the songs of a nation, and I don't care who writes its laws. Let me write the songs of a nation, and I don't care who writes its laws. What Andrew Fletcher was really envisioning or reflecting is that the artists, the musicians in particular, reflect the ethos and the pathos of a culture. They do not have to worry about being academically precise. They express the existential struggle that they go through in many areas of living. And this indeed is one of them. In our time, the songwriters address the issue just as cogent. Some years ago, the Moody Blues put it in these words: why do we never get an answer when we're knocking on the door with 1,000 million questions about hate and death and war? Because when we stop and look around us, there's nothing that we need in a world of persecution that is whirling in its greed. Why do we never get an answer when we're knocking at the door? One can sympathize with that, and the cry resonates each one of us. But you know, the one thing I noticed with every author or artist who addressed this issue, they are in our generation or in the previous century, it seems although they feel compelled to establish the point in its direst reality. And the more you begin to read authors on this, that is where almost everyone begins. But there was another very subtle fact I noticed, that many of them, while they knew where to begin in raising the question, struggled in where to begin while giving the answer. That, I believe, is an immense and a real challenge. Some years ago, the Far Side comic strip was picturing a massive butlers convention going on in a hotel. Thousands of butlers in their tuxedos had gathered, but ironically, the focus of attention was in the center of the ballroom, where one butler was lying stabbed to death. and an investigator with his assistant was standing looking at this butler stabbed to a room full of butlers and looking at his colleague and saying, "I hate to begin a week this way." Who done it in a butler's convention presents a very, very difficult challenge for an investigator. And when you're dealing with the problem of evil, you very quickly begin to recognize that it is not merely a problem. Even the problem itself is multifaceted. But what's real, I believe, is the entanglements soon make it look more like a mystery. Let me say this very clearly right from the beginning. When I use the word mystery, I am not at all suggesting that therefore it does not need any explanatory power. I'm only suggesting to you that there are many converging evidence, both from logic and from experience, that one will need to bring. But I like what Gabriel Marcel said in distinguishing a mystery. He said, a mystery is a problem, falling in love is a mystery. You get involved in some way, you are very much part of the very question you are raising. But let me begin. I would like to lay out some initial thoughts for you and then begin the challenge to the views will question the Christian worldview. First, the reality of evil and suffering. David Hume said it this way: were a stranger to drop suddenly into this world, I would show him as a specimen of its ills, a hospital full of diseases, a prison crowded with malefactors and debtors, a field strewn with carcasses, a fleet floundering in the ocean, a nation languishing under tyranny, famine, and pestilence. Honestly, I don't see how you can possibly square with an ultimate purpose of love. Another existentialist put it in these words: it is not science that has led me to doubt the purpose of God, it is the state of this world. It is this pitiless, unending struggle for existence among the nations. It is the collapse of our idealisms before the brute facts of force and chaos. That's a radical twist in the very constitution of the universe, which will always defeat man's hopes, make havoc of his dreams, and bring his pathetic optimism crashing in disaster. Purpose, look at the world, that settles it for me. Clear is a reality of evil and suffering. But secondly is the universality of it. Gautama, the Buddha, who is the progenitor basically of what we call Buddhistic thought, used the word dukkha. Now, dukkha is embattled by this reality. And as he began to find an answer, what prompted him was the reality of this, the impermanence. Stand here, for example, and try to explain Augustine's answer to this, or some contemporary philosopher's answer to this, and you have just lost a child. In the last week, all of a sudden these theorizings will seem so far away from what it is you're really looking for. Still, and there is a place in which they have their legitimacy. I will try to draw some from the intellectual struggle and from the existential or the emotional aspect. And obviously, we can't deal with it in any comprehensive sense. Hopefully, as the other gentlemen join me on the panel and in our interaction, some of the issues that have not been raised here might also surface. But as I begin, I want you to pause now and bear this in mind. Every worldview has to deal with the problem. Every worldview has to deal with the problem. Whether you come from a theistic viewpoint, an atheistic viewpoint, a pantheistic viewpoint, there is such a weightedness to that in some way it has to be either explained or, as some might try to even explain. And when every worldview deals with it, you'll notice something very fascinating. Number one is this: subsumed in every answer you will find, or assumed in every answer, is the purpose of life that has been assumed by that worldview. Do you follow what I'm saying? When you're dealing with an explanation of evil or suffering, you have assumed within your answer what the purpose is for human existence. C.S. Lewis says when a ship goes into the high seas, it has to answer 3 questions. Number 1, how to keep from sinking. Number 2, how to keep from bumping into other ships. And number 3, why is it out there in the first place anyway? How to keep from sinking may be personal ethics. How to keep from bumping into other ships may be social ethics. Why is it out there in the first place is essential ethics. And most secular humanists I have read or interacted with have assigned no established purpose, and we will sustain this as we go. So my beginning point here is to present a challenge, first of all, to the naturalist, the one who denies the existence of God, or even to the religious atheist, as Dr. Mahanti will be representing today, that position. You may find that a strange term, but he's very comfortable with describing his position and representing it that way. So explicitly, I will be dealing with the naturalist, but implicitly, I believe we will be addressing even the issues that we'll be interacting on later on with the others. I borrow a metaphor from Jean-Paul Sartre, the French existentialist philosopher, to begin my challenge. Sartre wrote a book some years ago called No Exit. In that, he pictured the struggle of an individual or of humanity doomed to find meaning in a meaningless world and struggling to accept this thrust, to escape this nihilistic sense that just impedes your day-to-day existence. How an individual can try to break away from this. There was really no exit from the reality of that kind of meaninglessness. And what I want to say to you is this, that the naturalist, in trying to escape or challenge the theistic framework, looks for doors through which to make the exit, and I'm suggesting those doors are marked no exit. Let me sustain those points for you. The first door is the evidential challenge that wants to take leave of God. If one grants the presence of evil, they say, then you cannot really talk about a viable entity, an all-powerful and an all-loving God. I remember being at the University of Nottingham where a student shot up from his much of evil in this world, there cannot be a God. And I said to him, but sir, when you say there's such a thing as evil, aren't you assuming there's such a thing as good? Yet when you say there's such a thing as good, aren't you assuming there's such a thing as a moral law on the basis of which to differentiate between good and evil? He struggled for a while. Yes, I will grant you that. You know, he stood there staring at me and he says to me, what then am I asking you? Now, maybe he was not as sophisticated in his ability to untangle this and felt somewhat trapped by it. But let me tell you this, people even more sophisticated than him have struggled with this issue. When Bertrand Russell was debating the Jesuit philosopher Frederick Copleston, Copleston looked at him and said, Mr. Russell, do you believe in good and bad? Russell said, yes, I do. How do you differentiate between good and bad? Russell says, the same way I differentiate between yellow and blue. But how you differentiate between yellow and blue? By seeing, don't you? Yes. And you differentiate between good and bad. Bertrand Russell said, on the basis of my feeling, what else? Now, you know, Copleston was a kind man. But somebody could have easily turned to Russell and say, in some cultures, they love their neighbors, and other cultures hate them, both on the basis of feeling. Do you have any personal preference in the matter? Now, just in case you think this is a straw man that is being set up, let me present it to you syllogistically here. Objective moral values exist only if God exists. Objective moral views do exist, therefore God exists. Now, in the first premise here, objective moral values exist only if God exists. This is challenged, of course, by the skeptic, and he or she says, I don't have to accept that. But I'll tell you what, the struggle that they find when they turn away from objective moral values is a monumental struggle, because the fact of the matter is, outside of God, they are not able to anchor objective moral values, and yet intuitively they know that some objective moral value is so certain within your own mind. And yet unable to anchor it, they move away then from that to try and come out with some other explanation, maybe a very subjective notion of this. Now, I want you to follow the argument, because I want to trace for you how the questioner here gets encroached within the problem, and the mystery really draws the questioner in. Probably one of the strongest voices against the Christian worldview is J.L. Mackie, who brought the evidential argument from evil to light, saying with good argument against the existence of God. But even J.L. Mackie said this, we might well argue that objective, intrinsically prescriptive features, supervenient upon natural ones, constitute so odd a cluster of qualities and relations that they are most unlikely to have arisen in the ordinary course of events without an all-powerful God to create them. Did you hear that? We might well argue that objective, intrinsically prescriptive features, supervenient upon natural ones, constitute so odd a cluster of qualities and relations that they are most unlikely to have arisen in the ordinary course of events without an all-powerful God to create them. And so the skeptic is ending up with a serious problem to try and explain how an impersonal, amoral first cause through a non-moral process produces a moral basis for. Mackey says, when you start talking about objective ethics, it presents such an awkward problem for us that you almost have to invoke transcendent being. But since it is so awkward to do that, he moves towards a subjective notion of ethics. What then happens if you move away from the objectivity of good? What happens to the problem of evil? There's a short step. Listen to Richard Dawkins of Oxford University, the renowned anti-theistic thinker. In a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt, other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at the bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. Blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. So from denying the moral lawgiver, as it were, and not finding a point of grounding for objective good, finally they move secondarily to the step that maybe even evil as we see it or doesn't have reality to it. If that is the case, you move then to the third step and you begin to see how the mystery now truly suctions in the individual who presents as the challenge to theism. Hobart Maurer, one-time professor at Harvard and Yale, an American president of the Psychological Association who committed suicide several years ago, made this comment in an article. He was not a Christian by any stretch of the definition of the terms here. But listen to what he says. For several decades, we psychologists have looked upon the whole matter of sin and moral accountability as a great incubus, and we've acclaimed our liberation from sin as epoch-making. But at length we have discovered that to be free in this sense, that is to be sick rather than being sinful, is to court the danger of also becoming lost. In becoming amoral, ethically neutral and free, we have cut the very roots of our being, lost our deeper sense of selfhood and identity, and with neurotics now find ourselves asking, who am I? What is my deep? What does living really mean? This is a secular thinker saying this. In removing objective good and moving from the objective notion of evil and taking away this vertical dimension that psychologists were so want to resist in the notion of sin, he said all of a sudden we've lost the very roots of our being and we now wander around like neurotics asking ourselves, who am I? This internal inconsistency from the question of moral doctrine of some kind, and the modern skeptic doubts not only the institution he denounces, but the doctrine by which he denounces it. Thus he writes one book complaining that imperial oppression insults the purity of women. Then he writes another book, a novel, in which he insults it himself. As a politician, he cries that war is a waste of life. Then as a philosopher, that life itself is a waste. He lost his right to rebel against anything. Door number one, nothing normative. It's marked no exit. Door number two, but we can be good without God, someone might say. Harvard biologist Edward O. Wilson published a massive piece of work in which he says this: scientists and humanists should consider together the possibility that the time has come in it biologically. There are so many questions that come when you do this and move towards evolutionary ethics. Unfortunately, time is so quickly in this. So let me raise just one question. How do they explain what? Probably the best was Gary and Mary Jean Chauncey's story. Struggling to stay alive, their primary concern was to thrust their 11-year-old daughter, who was stricken with cerebral palsy and bound to a wheelchair, her into the arms of rescuers, paying in the process with their own lives. But their goal was to get her to safety. How does evolutionary ethics explain this? For evolutionary ethics, as entire says that first comes self-preservation, then progeny preservation, then lateral relative preservation, and then social altruism. You scratch my back and I'll scratch your back. But the bottom of it all is the protection of the strength that you can give, the strongest that you are. And here are parents protecting one so dependent, so fragile, so needy, so weak. Daniel Goldman, in his book Emotional Intelligence, begins his book with this to tell us it's about time we began to evaluate more how our ethics are tied into our very emotional makeup. Door number 2, we can't be good without God, to be used as an exit. Door number 3, if God is all powerful, why could he not have always made our Christian response? Somewhere, somehow, fallaciously, the skeptic has assumed that omnipotence means God can do anything. No, if God can do anything, the question would dissolve, wouldn't it? If God could make something mutually exclusive, then he can be loving and evil at the same time. You cannot that which is mutually exclusive and say, why can't God do that? When you talk about intrinsic freedom, can you really talk about it so engineered and reined in? I find this rather ironic coming from the skeptics, because the same skeptic arguing for the age of the universe and right for it in its billions of years and all of that, they make this comment: how can it be much younger than that? Why would God deceive us by giving us units of measurement that are not really representing what actually is? That would be a deceptive way, wouldn't it? But when they put their ethical hats on, they then want a freedom that is not actual. That there can be a deception to that freedom, that we can be free but always choose good at the same time. Alvin Plantinga has responded to this very convincingly in his response to J.L. Mackie and Anthony Flew. But what then of the Christian worldview? How does this really play out as God reveals here? Very quickly. First, God is the author of life. And in that authorship, not only as good, but as holy. It is important to bear this in mind. Not only good, but God is holy, meaning separate. Life is then intrinsically sacred, not a conferred sanctity by society, not a pragmatic sanctity that allows us to keep from eating each other up. This is an intrinsic sanctity, which means my race, my humanity, my sexuality are sacred gifts given by God to me as I have been fashioned in his image. Modern day artists reverse those very things, and that's why sensuality become the occupation of so many in their entertainment. God made life sacred, sexuality sacred. Life is intrinsically sacred. Secondly, and quickly, if God is the author, then there is a script. There is a storyline. The storyline tells life is all about and meant to be. If you remember, anyone of you have seen the play Phantom of the Opera, there used to be times I'll be driving in my car listening to some of its music. Some of it was jarring. Some of it was 10 youths go looting, bomb blast school. It is but the sound of man worshiping his maker. If chance be the father of all flesh, disaster is his rainbow in the sky. And when you hear state of emergency, sniper kills 10, youths go looting, bomb blast school, it is but the sound of man worshiping his maker. I remember going to hear Stephen Hawking at Cambridge University. And as you know, he speaks through his speech synthesizer. His question was, is man determined or free? A marvelous lecture. At the end, he says this: yes, man is determined, but since we do not know what is determined, he may as well not be. There was silence in the auditorium. There is a storyline, but we don't know it. There is a determinism here, a stranglehold of determinism, but since we don't know what it is, we may as well not be. Gould of Harvard repeatedly says there is no higher purpose, there is no higher meaning. For the Christian, number one, God is the author, life is sacred. Number two, there is a storyline. Number three, and quickly, if there is a story, what is the response? The response is that of worship. Worship is the first solitary response. That's why the first commandment is, you shall have no other gods before me. Why is that? because all that you see, diversity in diversity outside, is only representing what is going on the inside. The life on the inside needs to be harnessed first, and worship is the submission of all of our nature to God. It's the quickening of conscience by His holiness, nourishment of mind by His truth, purifying of imagination by His beauty, opening of the heart to His love, and submission of will to His purpose. All this gathered up in adoration is the greatest expression of which we are capable. That was given by Archbishop William Temple years ago. You see, the goal and the process of life's script is not just to do good deeds. It is the sanctity of the inner life, the binding together of all of my propensities. And when that is bound together, worship can be expressed not only at a church altar. Worship can be a place of work where you are involved and employed. Wasn't it not Eric Liddell in the film Chariots of Fire who said, God has made me for a purpose for China, made me fast, and when I run, I feel His pleasure. Ladies and gentlemen, the opposite of sacred in that sense is not secular. The opposite is profane, and profanity is where evil finds its ultimate expression. So worship is the first response, and out of worship comes love. And if love is the legitimate response of a free heart, love can never be coerced. It is the supreme ethic, love of God and love of your fellow human beings. Even Jean-Paul Sartre granted this. The man who wants to be loved does not desire the enslavement of the beloved. He is not bent on becoming the object of passion which flows forth mechanically. In all of this, where are you, God? And he says, seemingly out of nowhere, there welled up within me the same question, where is God? Where is He? Nowhere the voice emerged from within me as if saying, I said to myself, genuinely appalling is not just suffering as much as crass human, but can there be any such thing as horrifying wickedness if naturalism were true? I don't see how. There can be such a thing only as a rational way creatures are supposed to live, or words of a rock group singing some years ago. She begged me not to kill her. I gave her a rose, then slit her throat, watched her shake till her eyes closed, had sex with a corpse before I left her, and drew my name on the wall like helter-skelter. That's appalling wickedness. I've seen it in the days I was in Vietnam, in the days in Cambodia, Beirut. I have seen savagery of horrible kinds, heinous wickedness. And may I suggest to you, the list is long of men and women who left the avenues of skepticism because they could not explain this kind of wickedness rationally, and just as that's the way it is, we dance to the DNA. W.H. Auden is one of them. Professor Eleanor Stump, professor of philosophy at the University of St. Louis, has written a profound essay, Mirror of Evil, where she talks how in the middle of horrible evil, she suddenly saw the rays of goodness and felt tears running down the face, trying to explain those tears. How do you explain it? She says the constancy of evil coarsens the response till suddenly a trace of goodness penetrates that coarseness, and you follow that trail where it is going to lead. And she then to Christ and to His cross. I say it to you again, that the reason he asked the question is there is no explanation for such horrific wickedness unless you can claim moral responsibility and an objective, inherently good standard by which we must ourselves. Malcolm Muggeridge, The English Joy of Pleasure. The three doors that the skeptic tries to escape through. The evidential problem ends up being swallowed up by the problem when no objective moral good is affirmed. Try to come out with an evolutionary ethical system. Numerous factors. God is the author of life. Life is sacred. Number two, there is a script and a transcendent purpose to life. Number three, that purpose is in the response to the outflow of which is love. Number four, but how does one do this when evil itself seems so intrusive? The cross redefines the reality of evil and shows God right in the middle of our need. Number five, the problem of evil and suffering is internal before it is external. Death to self sprouts life in uniqueness. Finally, it is not weariness of pain that brings meaninglessness, but weariness with pleasure, and worship alone is the perpetual novelty. Yes, the songwriter raises the question. Answer when we're knocking on the door. with 1,000 million questions about hate and death and war. Because when we stop and look around us, there's nothing that we need in a world of persecution that is whirling in its greed. Why do we never get an answer when we're knocking on the door? Thankfully, ladies and gentlemen, even the artist knew how to go beyond just the question. And this is the way the song ends. I'm looking for change my life. I'm looking for a miracle in my life. I believe they would have found that answer in Jesus Christ. As I present this paper to you, I want you to know it is not easy, because there are challenges, immense challenges. And I want you to know that as tough as it is, I am utterly convinced that outside of the Christian answer and the cross of Christ, there is no answer. In fact, I'm not even sure how the question is ultimately going to be justified. But I think it's that in an occasion like this at the Faith and Science Lecture Forum, we can interact with those who will strongly disagree with us. And my hope is that somehow in this interaction, we'll be able to see either the strength or the weakness of various arguments and various issues. It was on this issue one day, sitting high atop a huge building in Dallas, Texas, where a businessman kept raising the question of evil and evil and evil and evil, and he kept raising it repeatedly. And finally, the man sitting next to me, watching us interact on this for hour after hour after hour, he looked at this businessman and said to him, I appreciate the fact that you're very, very concerned about the evil that you have seen around you. Can you help me to know you a little better so that I can hear you say what you have done about the evil that you have seen inside you? And there was pin drop silence. The answer is both external and internal. I've gone at high speed because I want to get a lot of this out here. We look forward to the discussion. Thank you for listening. I hope it's not been a drink from a fire hydrant. Take care.
I think that you weren't hearing me because of an issue. I miss my technicians tonight. But let me say that the issue of suffering has often caused many Christians to step back and to wonder, why is it that we have seem to answer this question? Deep pain and suffering. God gave us a world where everything was perfect. But what happened is that we decided that we were going to go away from Him. And because of that, it meant that we were now subject to pain, suffering, and we have to live with what God has given to us. Somebody has said that sometimes we ask ourselves the question, why is it that I am a Christian? Why is it that I have been serving God, but yet my little child died? My beloved child that died, and I am unable to deal with that fact. And the answer, of course, is in the fact that we cannot always, or we cannot really understand what God is doing. And therefore, I believe that we have to know that God has given us the avenue of prayer, so that we can look at Him, we can listen to Him, and He is going to give us the answers. Let's break for a short while I fix a technical problem here.